We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Gimel Amud Aleph Meseches Yoma. This is Yoma Daf 63a. The Gemara here is continuing a statement of Ravina with regards to a carbon shlamim. Ravina says, "Shachtan bachutz kodem sheniftechu dalsos hahechol." Let's say a person shechs a carbon shlamim outside the Beis Hamikdash, but it's before the doors of the hechol have been opened. So again, Ravina was saying, in a situation where the doors have not yet been opened, so that's like similar to mechusar hagrola, when you haven't drawn the lots for the seirim and Yom Kippurim, that's considered mechusar maisa. It's considered not really fit to be a carbon at that point because you're not allowed to shecht a carbon shlamim before the doors of the hechel have been opened. So if you shecht it bachutz before the doors of the hechel have been open, potter, you're going to be potter when it comes to shchutei chutz because it wasn't fit in that state anyway. As Ravina explains, my time, what's the reason? Mechusar psicha, mechusar maisa dami. Because again, if the doors of the hechel have not been opened, it's like you're mechusar maisa. You're missing a critical component to allow this animal to be ready to be a carbon. So it's not a problem of shechting it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara continues, Umiyas leiler Rav Chisda hoil. Does Rav Chisda really hold of the concept of hoil? And Rashi over here explains, Umiyas leiler Rav Chisda hoil. Does Rav Chisda really hold of hoil? L'chayiv al carbon she'enu roi l'Hashem ma'shehufresh bifnim v'shachtu b'chutz. You have here again this animal that is not fit to be the soyer l'Hashem because you haven't done the hagrola. But still, we say that if you shecht it outside the Beis Hamikdash, denei machayiv mishum hoil v'roi l'Hashem carbon acher. We say since the animal is fit to be a different carbon, so it is fit at some level to be a carbon. In this case, it was fit to be the chatos hachitzona. It was fit to be this carbon musaf of Yom Kippur. So since it's fit for some other carbon, so therefore you're chayiv mishum shchutei chutz. That's hoil. Hoil, the idea is since it's fit for something else, so it's considered chazi for the Beis Hamikdash. And if you shecht it outside the Beis Hamikdash, you're going to be chayiv for shchutei chutz. Does he really hold of that concept? V'yomer Rav Chisda, but Rav Chisda said in a different place, Pesach sheshachtu b'chutz. Let's say you have a carbon Pesach, and by the carbon Pesach also, you shecht it outside the proper area where it's supposed to be slaughtered. B'shar yemos hashana, but it's in other times of the year, meaning it's not the time for the carbon Pesach, you're doing it at some other time of the year, not Pesach time. So the halacha is lishmo potter. If you shecht it lishmo, meaning for the sake of a carbon Pesach, then you're going to be potter. The reason being, right now, it cannot be brought as a carbon Pesach, so you're doing shchutei chutz of the animal in a fashion where it could not have been brought bifnim. So you're not chayiv on shechting it outside the Beis Hamikdash if you couldn't bring it bifnim in the same manner. But shelo lishmo chayiv. But if you shecht it shelo lishmo, meaning you shecht it as a shlamim, now a carbon Pesach during other times of the year, you could bring it as a carbon shlamim. So now you're shechting it as a carbon shlamim, which it could be brought that way in the Beis Hamikdash, but you're doing it shchutei chutz. You're shechting it outside the Beis Hamikdash. So Rav Chisda said you're chayiv in that case. And so now the Gemara draws an inference. Taimod de shelo lishmo. The only reason why you're chayiv is because you shecht it not for carbon Pesach, you specifically shecht it as a shlamim. Hastama, but let's say you shecht it stam with no intention. So lishmohu pater, we would assume it's lishmo, and we say you're shechting it as a carbon Pesach, and therefore since it's not fit for a carbon Pesach now, because it's not Pesach time, therefore you're pater. But one second, why would we say that? If we say that in theory it could be for something else, we should apply that over here also. In theory, it could be a shlamim. V'amai, why should we say you're pater when you shecht it stam? Lema hoil v'roi shelo lishmo b'fnim. We should say, since in theory it is fit, if you were to do it shelo lishmo b'fnim. This seems to imply that Rav Chisda does not hold of the concept of hoil. And so the Gemara answers, Hachi hashta, what kind of comparison are you really making over here? Hazam, over there in that case, when you're talking about a carbon Pesach, and it in theory could be brought as a shlamim, boy akira, you need to uproot it from being a carbon Pesach in order to bring it as a shlamim. Hi lo boy akira, but over here there's just two different kinds of chatos. There's the chatos la'Hashem, and then there's the chatos hachitzona. Those are both chatos. You don't need to uproot it, and therefore you could say in theory it's fit for this other kind of chatos. As Rashi over here explains, boy akira eno roy bifnim l'shlamim. You can't bring it bifnim as a shlamim. Elam kein okar Shem Pesach mimenu b'shchitaso, unless you uproot the Shem Pesach from this animal when you shecht it. Hilkach lav meskalbel b'fnimhu, therefore it's not considered ready to be brought in the Beis Hamikdash. Kol kamen de lo akri, if you don't actually uproot it from being a carbon Pesach. But hai lo boyakir, but in this case there's no uprooting necessary. Ve'ava b'shalachu l'shem seir hanasa b'fnim. Now even though you bought it to be the seir that's brought b'fnim, the soyer LaHashem, but there is another kind of carbon chatos you can bring with it. Zeh chatos v'zeh chatos. There's the chatas bifnim and there's the chatas chitzona. Shnei and shavin bishmosei, and they both have the same name. If they both have the same name, so then you can say it's theoretically fit for a different kind of carbon, but also a chatas in the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore you're chayiv and shchutei chutz in this particular case. You can't compare it to the case of the carbon Pesach. And the Gemara now continues with a technical point. Rava Bar Simi masni lehu b'derabba. Rava Bar Simi had this entire discussion not with Rav Chisda, but it was with Rabba. The kashale derabba aderabba. He had a contradiction within Rabba. Umeshani kidushanin, and it was the exact same Gemara. He gave the same exact answer. In other words, the same discussion, but instead of Rav Chisda, he had the conversation with Rabba. Rashi says masni lehu b'derabba hani tarti shmaitza de Rav Chisda. The two teachings of Rav Chisda that we had before. Hada amar le'el ho'elu ru'uyin l'soyer hanasa b'chutz. The first one where he says since you could bring it as the so'ir of the chatos hachitzona, so he said a ho'el, therefore it is considered fit and you're chayiv. V'hada amar Rav Chisda pesach sheshachtu b'chutz b'shar yemos hashana. And then what seemed to be a contradiction by carbon Pesach, where if you did it stam, so in that case we said you're not chayiv for shchutei chutz. You don't say it's fit in theory to be a shlamim. So masni lo b'derabba amrinu. He said that it was done by Rab. Again, he had a contradiction within Rabba instead of Rav Chisda, and he answered the same answer. And the Gemara continues, Ki yasa Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yirmiyah Amar Rav Yochanan. When Rav Dimi came, he said in the name of Rav Yirmiyah, in the name of Rav Yochanan, Pesach sheshachdu b'chutz b'shar yemos hashana. Let's say you have a carbon Pesach, you shechted outside the Beis HaMikdash during other times of the year, not Pesach time. Bein lishma, whether you shechted as a carbon Pesach, bein shalo lishma, whether you shechted not as a carbon Pesach but as a shlamim, potter. In both cases, you're going to be potter. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Dimi said, Amriso l'shmaita kame de Rabbi Yirmiyah. I said over the sugya in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah as follows. B'shalom l'shmo. We understand if you shecht it l'shmo, meaning you're shechting it as a carbon Pesach at a time that it cannot be brought as a carbon Pesach. So the halo chazilei, it's not fit to be a carbon Pesach. So therefore, since it's not fit to be a carbon Pesach, you shecht it outside the Beis HaMikdash, you're potter, because you couldn't have brought it inside the Beis HaMikdash in this fashion. Elo shalo l'shmo, but if you shecht it not as a carbon Pesach, you shecht it as a shlamim, so amai, so why should you be potter? Hachazi shalo l'shmo b'fnim. As we said before, it is fit to be brought in the Beis HaMikdash as a shlamim, meaning shalo l'shmo. So you took a carbon, which you could have brought in the Beis HaMikdash, and you shechted it outside the Beis HaMikdash. V'yomar li, so he answered to me, Akira schutz lav shmo akira. When you uproot it from being a carbon Pesach, like we said before, when you have a carbon Pesach b'shar yemos hashana, you have to uproot it from the Shem Pesach, and you have to bring it as a carbon shlamim. You got to do an uprooting from the original name. Now, if you're doing an uprooting from the carbon Pesach and you're saying it's a shlamim, you can't do that outside the Beis HaMikdash. The akira only works within the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore you haven't really uprooted it. Rashi over here says, Akiras chutz, Akiras shem, b'shchitas chutz. If you try to uproot its original name, in this case carbon Pesach, when you're shechting it outside the Mikdash, lo shma akira, that's not called akira. Im hichsher akasa Pesach b'shar yemos hashana b'shlamim, when the Torah says you can bring a carbon Pesach during other times of the year as a shlamim, lo hichshiru ela b'fnim, that's only true in the Beis HaMikdash. Uvakiras Hashem, and with an uprooting of the name. Aval b'chutz liolam shmo Allah. But if you're going to do it b'chutz, the original carbon Pesach name sticks with it, and therefore it's not going to be chayiv for shchutei chutz. And the Gemara continues, Ki yasa Ravin Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah and the name of Rabbi Yochanan as follows: Pesach sheshachdu b'chutz b'shar yemos hashana. If you have a carbon Pesach that you shechted outside the Beis HaMikdash during other times of the year, same case. Bein lishmo, bein shalo lishmo. Whether you do it as a carbon Pesach, whether you do it not as a carbon Pesach but a shlamim, chayiv. You're going to be chayiv. In other words, the exact opposite psak. In this psak, the situation is you're chayiv even if you do it as a carbon Pesach, which it's certainly not fit to be a carbon Pesach during other times of the year. Still, you're going to be chayiv. So the Gemara says, what's going on with that psak? Va'afilu l'shmo. Even in a situation where you shecht it as a carbon Pesach, it's going to be chayav for shchutei chutz when you could have never brought it as a carbon Pesach in the Beis HaMikdash. V'atanan, but we learned in the Mishnah, mechusar zman. Let's say you have a situation of a carbon that's mechusar zman, meaning it's not the time to bring this carbon. Bein begufa, whether the animal itself is not ready to be brought, the time is still not the time to bring it. Bein bebailim, or whether the owner is not ready to bring the carbon. Ve'ezeu mechusar zman bebailim. And the Mishnah continues, continues, what is considered mechusar zman when it comes to the bailim? The following situation: hazav, v'hazava, v'hayoledes, v'hamitzora. Let's say you have a situation of a zav, yoledes, mitzora. These are people that are supposed to bring the carbon at a certain time after they became tameh. So after a certain period of time, but now they're bringing it a little early. So sheikrivu chatasam v'ashamam b'chutz. If they bring their carbon chatos, their carbon asham b'chutz, and again it's lifnei hazman, it's before the proper time. So in all of those cases, peturin, you're going to be patur in these cases because again it wasn't right to be brought inside the Beis Hamikdash, so you're patur if you bring it outside the Beis Hamikdash. Olosein v'shalmei. Now if they bring their carbon ola or their carbon shlamim, that's a little different because you can in theory bring it as an edava in the Beis Hamikdash. So b'chutz chayav, and if they do those b'chutz, then they're going to be chayiv. And Rashi over here says, v'hatzanan, we learned in the Mishnah b'Meseches Zvachim, this is a Mishnah in Zvachim, mechusar zman potter al shchitas chutz. If it's not ready at the right time to be brought, if you shecht it outside the Beis Hamikdash, it's not a problem of shchutei chutz. Bein shehu mechusar zman begufo, bein shehu mechusar zman b'bailim. Doesn't matter whether the animal wasn't ready, it wasn't the animal's time, or the owner's time. Begufo, what's an example of not the animal's time? Kagon b'soch shmona l'leidaso. It's still within the first 8 days the animal was born. The animal is not old enough to bring as a carbon. And another example is, again, with the bailim, the zav sheyesh zman l'havas carbon oseim. All these various individuals, there's a certain time where they're supposed to bring their carbon. L'sof sfiras shiva, v'hayoledes l'sof melos yimei tahara, at the end of counting 7 days, at the end of the days of purity for a woman who gives birth. All of these have a time period. So sheikrivu lifnei hazman, if they bring it before the time period, chatoson v'ashaman b'chutz, they bring the carbon chatos or the carbon asham they're supposed to bring, and they bring it outside the mikdash, petur in their pots, or she'einon miskablim bifnim, because you couldn't have brought it inside the mikdash at that time. Lo lechova v'lo l'nadavi, you couldn't have brought it for the obligation, and you can't bring it as a donation, obviously. Lechova misham delo matazim now, it's not the time for the obligation. V'l'nadavi shein chatos v'asham bal l'nadavi, you can't bring a chatos and an asham as a donation. V'hai asham b'mitzora hu dilu b'zav v'zav v'yoledis leka asham. Rashi points out there is no asham, there's no carbon asham by a zav, zav, and a yoledis, it's just by a mitzora, but the point is, whatever it is, whether it's a chatos, whether it's an asham. But olosei and v'sham meyem chayavin, and ola, shlamim, that already you're chayiv, she'olo, shlamim, baim nedava, because you can bring a carbon ola, you could bring a carbon shlamim as a donation, u'miskablin nedava b'fnim, you could bring it inside the Beis HaMikdash, it's possible to do that, and therefore you're going to be chayiv for shchutei chutz. Rashi says over here, over Meseches Zvachim Parchinan, in Meseches Zvachim, we ask on this, v'hani b'nei shlamim ninu, can you even bring these as a shlamim? What's going on? U'mishanin on tani nazir bahadayu. So these individuals don't bring a shlamim, but nazir, just put nazir in the list. So a nazir is able to, brings a shlamim, so that's what's going to apply with the shlamim. V'af mitzora lo shaninu, but Mishnah mitzora is also not in the Mishnah. U'parchinan hasam hani b'nei ashamos ninu, that's why the Gemara asks, who's bringing an asham in this list? U'mishanin on tani mitzora badayu. Then the Gemara says, mitzora should also be in the list. In other words, the Mishnah doesn't include all the various individuals who could be mechusar zman, and the Gemara adds in those various individuals. And in any case, the Gemara continues on this Mishnah. V'yomer Rav Chilkiya bar Tuvi. Rav Chilkiya bar Tuvi said on this Mishnah, Lo shanu ela lishmo. This whole halach is only true if you bring it lishmo, you bring it for the carbon it's intended for. Avol shelo lishmo. But let's say you take these carbonas, mechusar zman, but you don't bring it for what they're intended for. You bring it for another carbon. So chayiv. So in that case, you'd be chayiv because it's fit to be brought inside the Beis HaMikdash in a different fashion. Therefore, if you do it outside the Beis HaMikdash, you're going to be chayiv. But in any case, what's the point? Lishmo miya pater. If you do it lishmo, you bring it for that particular carbon, and it's mechusar zman, it's considered not roy for that carbon, and therefore you're not chayiv on shchutei chutz. So again, that brings us back to this question, Amai, why is that the case? Neima hoil v'ru'uyin shelo lishmo b'fnim. Why don't we say like what we seem to be saying up above, that since in theory you could bring it shelo lishmo, and you could bring it in the Beis HaMikdash for that purpose, so then over here also, even though you're doing it lishmo, it should still be chayiv for shchutei chutz. We should say the same thing by carbon Pesach as we seem to be saying over here. And so the Gemara answers, you can't compare the carbon Pesach to these cases of mechusar zman. Gemara says, Hachi hashta, what kind of comparison are you making? Hasam boy akira. Over there you need an akira, you need to uproot it. Hacha Pesach b'shar yemos hashana. Here the Gemara is saying the opposite logic. Here a carbon Pesach during other times of the year, shlamim ninu. It is automatically a shlamim. In other words, according to this statement over here of Ravin, in the name of Rabbi Yirmi, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who says you're always chayiv, whether it's lishmo, whether it's shelo lishmo, meaning even if you're bringing it as a carbon Pesach during other times of the year, certainly not fit to be a carbon Pesach in the Beis HaMikdash at that time, still you're chayiv, because according to this opinion, automatically a Korban Pesach during other times of the years of Shlomim. It doesn't need an Akira. Therefore, we say it's in theory fit Shalol Lishmo. You don't apply that in these cases of Mechusar Zman in the Mishnah and Zvachim. And we'll take a look at Rashi over here. V'yomer Rav Chilkiya lo shanu da'asham b'chutz Mechusar Zman b'baylim potter. We only say this halacha of an asham outside the mikdash by Mechusar Zman that it's potter el lishmo. If you bring it as an asham, de'enu roy lishmo with them. You can't bring it as an asham. It's Mechusar Zman. Avol shalol lishmo. But let's say you take the same animal and say, I'm not bringing it as an asham. Kigon l'shem olo, l'shem shlomim. You try to bring it as an ola or shlomim. In those cases, chayiv, you're chayiv. Shekain roy lifnim, kayotze bo bifnim. You could, in theory, bring it as an ola or shlomim in the mikdash. So you do it outside the mikdash, it's going to be a problem of shchutei chutz. T'chol hazvachim shenizbechu shalol lishma ksherin. Rashi says all karbanis you bring them shalol lishma, it's still kosher. Ela shalol ola l'bayim l'shem chova. It doesn't fulfill the obligation. If it's an obligatory carbon, the bailim will not have fulfilled the obligation, but the carbon itself is kosher. Chutz min ha-pesach bezmano v'achatos b'chol zman. The only exceptions to this rule are the carbon Pesach on Pesach and the carbon chatos all the time. There, it's not true. But in all other cases, if you do it shalol lishmo, it's still going to be kosher, and that's why again the carbon asham, if you do it shalol lishmo, shchutei chutz, it's going to be a problem. And so the Gemara said, "V'amai lishmo pater le'mahoel kedukamrit." Why are you saying that if it's lishmo it's pater? We should say since in theory it could be shalol lishmo. That's what you're saying by Pesach. And the Gemara again says Pesach is different because shlomim have a stomach below akira. According to this version of the statement in the Gemara, it's automatically a shlomim. A carbon Pesach not in the time of Pesach is automatically a shlomim without akira. Meseches Pesachim over Parakam and Zvachim. This is learned out from Sukkah. And the Gemara continues, Rav Ashi masni chayev kedam rinon. Rav Ashi taught chayev just like we said before. Rashi says, Rav Ashi masni chayev behad dechiyasa Ravin. In other words, in the statement of Ravin, so according to Ravin, it doesn't matter if you do it lishmo, doesn't matter if you do it shalol lishmo by the carbon Pesach that's done not in the time of Pesach. In all situations, if you do shchutei chutz, it's going to be chayev. Rav Yirmiyah midifti masni potter. But Rav Yirmiyah midifti had the opposite. He said you're always potter, as Rashi over here says. Rav Yirmiyah masni potter bein lishmo bein shalol lishmo. Doesn't matter if you shech the carbon Pesach not in the time of Pesach lishmo, or whether you do it shalol lishmo, you're always potter. Kerev dimi. That's like the statement that Rav Dimi had earlier in the Gemara. So they had different versions of what is the halacha. And the Gemara explains, Kasava Rav Yirmiyah holds Pesach b'shar yemos hashana boyakira. Number one, if you're shechting a carbon Pesach during other times of the year, not during Pesach, you do need to uproot it. It's not automatically a shlomim. And furthermore, v'akiras chutz lav shmo akira. If you try to do an akira outside the Beis Hamikdash, that's not even called akira. So therefore, of course, if you do it lishmo, it's going to be patur because you can't bring it as a carbon Pesach at that time of the year, even in the Beis Hamikdash. But even if you do it shalol lishmo, so you're doing an akira, but an akiras chutz is not considered an akira. Upliga de Rav Chilkiya bar Tuvi. That, of course, argues on what Rav Chilkiya bar Tuvi said before, as Rashi over here says, Upliga de Rav Chilkiya diyamar akiras chutz shmo akira. What Rav Chilkiya said before was that akiras chutz is considered an akira. That's what Rav Chilkiya said right over here. Rav Chilkiya said, Lo shano ela lishmo, avol shalo lishmo chayiv. Meaning, if you do an akira, if you do it shalo lishmo, so then you are chayiv, because he held that akiras chutz is considered an akira. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the master said, quoting what we said previously, Mishehigril alein. Once you already draw the lottery on the two seirim on Yom Kippurim, so chayiv in such a situation, you're chayiv al shel shem. Meaning, if you shecht the seir la Hashem outside the Beis Hamikdash, you're going to be chayiv for shchutei chutz because it was roy, it was fit to bring it in the Beis Hamikdash la Hashem, and now you're shechting it outside the Beis Hamikdash. However, upater al shel azazel, you're going to be pater on the one that's designated la azazel, because of course that's not fit to be brought as a carbon in the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara now says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, the pasuk says, Ish ish mi Beis Yisrael, asher yishchat shor o kesev o eiz b'machane. If somebody shechs one of these animals in the camp, or asher yishchad michutz lamachane, or shechs them outside of the camp, v'al pesach oel moed lo heviu, he doesn't bring it to the entrance of the oel moed, to the mishkan, lahakriv carbon laHashem, to bring it as a carbon. We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Gimel Amud Beis.